Good evening, everyone. I'm Superintendent Elsie Arnson, and I'm pleased to host a discussion of our federal COVID relief dollars. They came into our state in 2020. We were one of the very first states that received the dollars, and then we got them out as fast as possible. If we can all remember what it was like at that point of time, I know where I was. I know when Governor Bullock closed our schools. I remember all of that. We had loss of our family. I know others probably on this call and people in your communities that you also know that there were challenges because we didn't know anything about it. But Montana came up to the charge of that, and we got the first federal dollars out to our schools as fast as possible. So we have quite a ripe agenda tonight. I just want to share that you'll see the big sky blue. Those are our Montana OPI supporters for tonight's meeting. We also have Dr. Urban and we have Dr. Stoddard that have come from MSU. We gave them all of the ESSER dollars and all of the monies in the data that came back from our public schools when they received the flow of the 600 million of this COVID relief money. And they've come up with some conclusions where they're not quite buttoned up with their report yet. That will be transparently given in October. But right now they've got some great information. I have then some discussion with our CFO here at the OPI. We received dollars as well to help implement the dollars, and that will be April Grady. And then I have Katie Bloodgood, who worked with a group of 170 Montanans that really looked at our school funding. We know in 2025, there will be an opening of a decennial funding formula study. And so we went ahead of that, did a little bit of homework, asked Montanans what it is that they thought could help with our funding formula moving forward. But right now, I'd like to introduce Wendy Fons. She has been, I believe, the angel that has helped our school districts recognize the allowable uses and encourage them, help them understand and untwine any of the difficulties that might have been moving forward, either from our agency or from the federal government with allowable uses. She's always had the school districts at heart. And then I have Dr. Mergel. Julie is our Chief Programming Officer. She is the one who helped put the plan together because as all states, before we received the dollars, we were to give a state plan on what we were going to do with the money, and we are held accountable with it. So with that, with no further ado, and I also wanted to say, use the chat box, please. This is an interactive discussion. I don't want it to last and take any more of your precious time, but use the chat. We'll stop momentarily. Please raise your hand as well so that we can have any discussions for clarification or any other questions you might ask. So with that, Wendy, let's go ahead. What did our schools do from your, and share with the three buckets of what the monies were and all of that. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Superintendent, and thank you everyone for joining this evening to kind of overview the ESSER timeline, the allowable uses, and then also the plans, because the plans are, as the Superintendent indicated, something that not only the state of Montana is adhering to, but also you as districts or those who have students in the schools, they're adhering to those plans as well. So I wanted to start with just a very brief overview of our website, because a lot of this information will be very quick and fast, but you can always go back to it. Our website is very transparent, but like all websites, there's a lot of information. So I'm going to give you a quick view of those. Katie, I think I have share. Yes. So if we look at our website here, we are always in the ESSER team looking at this wonderful time clock that just keeps moving us forward as we move through the ESSER timeline. So it does keep us on our toes an awful lot. But right below that is a really nice timeline that Rebecca Brown, our manager, put together for us. And it's basically showing, as the superintendent indicated, we received all of these funds in March of 2020, and now we are anchored on the final obligation of 3. within an 11-month period, 1, 2, and 3 funding, so that $605 million was available to districts in the state to use for their educational purposes and helping with COVID. So it's a pretty fluid. I think this sort of snake design is good, showing the movement that we've had to move through. This is a thermostat, and while it's not a timeline, it does show the funding that we're having to work with. So top and bottom, top shows us how much roughly that we have left to spend. Bottom shows us how much has been spent. And keep in mind, this is updated roughly once a month, so it's changing daily as we walk through this. When we move down to this highlights section and looking at the allowable uses, there are a couple of highlights to note. One of them is this frequently asked question. It's from the Department of Ed, and that's a really good document to look at. You can search it like any PDF. You do a Control F and you can type in the word construction. You can type in staff. You can type in recruitment and retention. And it's just a document that goes through a number of pages, as you can see, 97, that we search through to find out what is an allowable use. Like many documents that come from the Department of Ed, and we love them dearly, but they can be a challenge, there are many statements that will indicate things like, we strongly discourage construction, but we won't disallow it. So we get stuck in the middle of that, and we are really trying to advocate for what the districts need at their side, because at the end, you're the experts. The districts are the ones who are the most familiar with their own student needs. But this document is our guide, among other things. And again, it can all be found in our highlighted section here. We have a couple of other items in here. The liquidation is something that constantly is brought up of, when do we have to spend these funds? How do we spend them? And the how is through our management system of e-grants. And then the when do we have to spend them? We can look at some comparison charts. This was done very early on in 2021. And it does show, not a very pretty document, but it does show when we need to use those funds and the deadlines for them. So you can crosswalk that in a chart. We're pretty much done with 1 and 2, and we are now closing out 3. In addition to those views, we also have some information about where the funds have been spent. So we have a timeline on here. We have what is allowable to spend them on. And then if anyone's interested in goes, so what does my district have left? You can come down here to allocation and status update. And through this, you can come to a monthly report, which will show you per district. Again, a PDF file, Control F will take you to whatever district you want to look at, and it will show you what has been spent and where we have remaining. This far right-hand corner is the one that shows you. Now, a point of caution, this file again is a monthly update. And what this is showing, just like we all have our own checkbooks, this money is what has actually been pulled out of the checkbook. These funds have all been identified for use. So the districts, as part of their initial plan and the application, had to identify where the funds were going to be used. It's an amendable grant, so they can change it, but this gives you an indication of what is there that is already obligated, is already identified, but is going to still be pulled out of that checking account, if you will. I think the only other thing I had here to show was just that on this website, we have some really good information with stories, which is a really nice place to look at how the funds have been used. These are some summer programs, how many students have been served, what topic, focusing on the reading and the math in here. And I know there's going to be further discussion on that later. We have the plans, and Julie, if you wanted to talk a little bit about the state plan, each individual school district has its own plan. Again, these are only updated every 6 months. PDF to go search your district, and then you can pull up usually 1 to 3 priorities. And Julia, if there are any questions, I can answer those, but we can also switch to the state plan.
So Wendy, if you could just identify, we had 3 different buckets that came under 3 different types of laws. So if you would share, what was the first amount of money that went? And they were all on a year or an annual time. If you could just share, there we have a diagram.
Right here, so it's just showing how much came into the state. And we did have one, and we put these extra names because ESSER has a lot of names, so they're called different things, but we did have here 41 million that came in as ESSER 1. We had 170 come in as 2, and 382 come in as 3. And
Excellent.
then we also had Ian's for the non-public school. Thank you,
Thank you.
Superintendent.
So just to double down on that, we're only working on ESSER 3 right now, and it is concluding on September 30th.
Mhm.
And making sure then that we are accountable. All of the dollars were flown into the schools, and they were done by a funding formula that the federal government provided. And so it went into a checking account. So what we're hoping is that all those school districts go ahead and draw down that checking account and use it on all of the allowable uses. The allowable uses in number 1 was totally different. Well, not totally different, but it was more on health and safety. It expanded with ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. So there are a lot of opportunities for amendments to be made and things like that for schools to be able to do this work. Any questions for Wendy? Anybody have their hand up? Katie, do you see anybody? Anything in chat?
Not at the moment.
Okay. Dr. Mergel, if you could share with us pretty much what Montana State Plan looked like as before we received the dollars that we had to put together a plan, just like every school district also did.
Yes, thank you, Elsie. So I'm just going to pull up my screen really quick. And so when you go to the main OPI website that Wendy was just sharing with us, and you go to this page, are you guys seeing that screen okay?
Mhm.
Okay. And you go down to that location where Wendy was just located under the ESSER State and District Plan Carrot, and you click on this state plan. There's a lot of detailed information in here, but there's a couple places I just want to call our attention to. And so that's kind of down about on page 38. And so when Wendy was just sharing with us, she was sharing the amount of money that had come forward for the schools, the 90% of the ESSER money for ESSER 3 that went out to the schools. But there was 10% set aside that was here at the state that went to the state from ESSER 3 to support some things. And so I was just looking for that chart. Sorry, you guys, let me find that. I had it a second ago. Let's see here. So in this plan on page 28, this chart kind of showed the money that came in for each of the different ESSER buckets, 1, 2, and 3. And so what you'll notice here is that in ESSER 1, the majority of that money went out to our school districts. And then in ESSER 2, there was some more money that was out to the school districts and a little bit more that was actually allocated here. And so because the legislature was in session under House Bill 630, they had allocated some of the ESSER 2 monies into some special pockets, such as education leadership, data modernization. But then when ESSER 3 came, there was another bucket of money. The majority of that was what Wendy was just sharing with you on all the thermometers and timeline, went out to our school districts. But there was 10% that was spread across these other areas here for ESSER 3. And so because the legislature was again in session at that time through House Bill 632, they were able to kind of allocate some. Some of these things were very particular that you had to spend a certain amount of, at least at a minimum, a percentage. So just want to call attention to, so for data modernization, we've been doing a lot of work in data modernization with our ESSER funds. We did some work around education leadership, offered some teacher leadership programs, some district superintendent leadership programs, and did some work around that particular area. But the main 3 buckets under ESSER 3 for the 10% set aside that was here at the agency, about 19 million was for learning loss. And in learning loss, we were able to do a couple of different programmings. We were able to put a residency project into place where teachers were able to be paid to do their student teaching and do it for a full year. That was so successful in the data coming in on that, that it was one, highlighted by the department as a best practice, but two, became actually funded through the legislature to kind of carry on. And so now we're starting in our third year on the residency and continuing that project. So in that particular case, we were able to kind of innovate and learn some things, get some things into practice that were then sustained and picked up by other funding because it's been so impactful. Other things that we've done with state learning loss, we had some career coaches through 9 different regions in the state working on career awareness, career exploration, and really helping with that post-secondary readiness component with our career coaches. That was a really great program that really laid the foundation for us to learn some things that now we're going to continue to do that work, but braiding some of our other federal funding and some of our general fund to continue. And so those were just a couple of samples. We did some things around providing programming for Waterford or programming for Discovery Ed and Dreambox. These were some particular programs that we provided to our schools to be helping students with that learning loss for tutoring. But then the other 2 big buckets that I just wanted to point out were the state summer enrichment and the state after school program. And so Wendy ran those programs with her team, and that put out some money for schools to provide some great academic programming in the summer, and some great enrichment and wraparound services and after school programming, tutoring as well. There were some incredible, Wendy would be able to speak more to it, but just some really incredible opportunities of different agencies working with our school systems. So it wasn't just our school systems, it was also some other community-based organizations that helped provide some of that after school programming. So I just wanted to highlight that we talk a lot about kind of the money that went out to our schools to get as close as possible to our kiddos, but there was some money here that we were able to utilize as an agency to really begin to innovate and move forward and address some of the learning loss, but also start to reform where we wanted to go next. So I stand for any questions that you might have, but Elsie, that's all that I've got for you today.
Thank you, Julie. Looks like we have something in the chat. Kate, what do we got?
Yes, so it was Gary's question regarding an extension for the reallocated funds. So I don't know if we want to start to go into that now, or do we want to wait to the end to address questions?
Let's go ahead and answer questions.
So I think that question, Superintendent and Gary, have to do with the liquidation. I'm not sure about the reallocation piece. Can Gary, is it the liquidation, like how that process works? Is that what the question was?
Gary, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself just to give a little bit more context.
Thank you. Yes, my question is just, in that press release, it indicated that there was about $100 million that was going to be left over. And I understand that the money was allocated to districts, but my question is, with a significant number of districts facing fairly significant budget shortfalls to address learning loss, was it possible in any way to either reallocate some of that money to districts that were facing those type of issues, or to seek extensions on that so that there was more time to spend those resources allocated? Just wondering what had been pursued in those realms.
So let me first clarify, and thank you for bringing that up. There is a difference between the 100 million being left over and being identified by schools for use. So there isn't any funding that's left over. Schools have been given all of the funding of the 90%, as Dr. Mergel had indicated. And then they go ahead and say in their initial budget, amendable, they say, this is what I'm going to use it for. And as they continue to process it, they draw it out of their checkbook. It's kind of like a credit card piece, if you think about it. You use your credit card, you identify what you're using it, you may have even bought it, and then you go back to the bank and you actually draw the funds out. It's that kind of a process. So the 100,000 or the 100 million isn't left over. So I want to make that piece clear to begin with. However, we have been sharing with districts for about the last 6 months in quarterly reminders and regular conversation that if for some reason they cannot expend all the funding, if they've decided they have additional funding from some other source, that we'd like them to return those funds to us so that we can distribute those in sort of the sick leave policy or sick leave bank policy that's often used. So a district who might suddenly have had lead identified in their water, or a fire in the building, or some area of major health concern, that then those funds become available. In order to do that, there are very strict guidelines from the Department of Ed that says we have to allocate those funds out in a proportional way that we give school districts title funding. What that meant during 2 was that some districts got $2. And then they have to go through a process and close out again. So we did ask the Department of Ed, and they did allow us to create a form to say, if you're going to get a small amount of money, do you want to be considered for that $1 or $2? So that at the end, if we have extra funding that's returned, we can allocate it to those districts up front and in a larger amount. For about, again, the last 6 months, we have been asking districts to tell us what their additional needs are. If there's some project that they're working on, they don't have that funding, we are gathering that information. To be very honest, at the end of the day, and I've had multiple conversations with the superintendent and the rest of our team on this, our goal is to have all of those fundings at the schools where it was initially allocated, because that's where the needs are. And so we're working very hard to try and have that happen. So I don't anticipate with 3 that we're going to have any extra funds.
Thank you, Wendy.
Mhm.
So Trish, seems that you have one. Can you give an explainer? Let me see what I've got here. Quick explainer as to what exactly data modernization is. And it looks like it's up to 26 million. Is that right? Julie, if you want to share what data modernization is?
Sure, Elsie. So hi, Trish. So in terms of data modernization, there's a couple of things that have been done under that. The first thing we did was just really modernize some of the systems here at the agency to really get things more efficient, really ensure a much more comprehensive process. And one of those was the licensure system. So out of the gate, that was one of the first things that we did for data modernization, was to move from a static system to a cloud-based system and purchase a system that was more real time and had better supports and reporting in it. And that's enabled us to really, I think, have better, higher productivity, if you will, and be able to turn over licenses and within many times, 24 to 48 hours versus previously, sometimes it would take weeks, just because the old system was much more cumbersome. But I would say the biggest piece has been a partnership with Power School in terms of them creating what are forthcoming 2 different kinds of platforms. One of them is to replace what we've called the GEM system here at the agency. And that's the general warehouse where we collect all of kinds of different student data, whether it's enrollment, achievement data, attendance, graduation, that information. And so that's kind of modernizing that. It's putting that into this kind of like pulling all that data into a location in a secure way that then what they call Snowflake, putting it into a data lake to be able to kind of pull that out into that system. So that's the one thing. So it'll be a platform available to community, other places to be able to kind of look at that data and then be able to kind of manipulate the data to kind of understand it. But the second way around the Power School data modernization component that's happening is for our schools to have their own data dashboards, to be able to kind of take a look at all of that data and to be determining where are they finding successes, where are they seeing some gaps, so that they can utilize that data to make some good instructional decisions, to make some decisions around programming that they might be offering. So that project, that's a pretty big component of the data modernization. A third piece we did was around the accreditation system. So we formally didn't really have a system to collect all of this. We just kind of had a data system where we collected things, not necessarily the ability to attach documents or provide evidence and reports, and then be able to kind of sort through that data in really thoughtful ways. So that's another example of data modernization. And I know that April's online, our CFO, but we were looking at some other forms of data modernization through some systems for our schools around grant management and grant funding. But those are some of the components, Elsie and Trish, for data modernization.
Thank you. You know, we're government and we were paper and pencil when I even got in close to 8 years ago. So really having data security in mind and also ease and efficiency, changing our legacy systems, moving forward. And we're really pleased that the legislature recognized that it's not just our agency and our customers being our 400 plus schools that we're in need in our teachers. But other government things as well used with the ESSER. I hope, Jordan, you understood the definition of learning loss. Is there any other question that you might, or more clarification on what we did as a Montanan team to define it, but also within the federal guidelines of what learning loss was? Hopefully we answered. And then,
Sorry. So yeah, I understood what was written to me. I guess who gets to define it? Is that the federal government? Does that come from the federal government's guidelines?
Julie?
And then, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jordan, for the question. So in terms of learning loss, that was their term that they used. And so they kind of defined that. That's the kind of the bucket that they put it into. But when we wrote the state plan, there was a group that kind of came together to write that. They thought it would be better to use another phrase to kind of capture what was lost instructional time, because it's very difficult to say, well, a student learned something and then you're saying they had loss, meaning they academically lost something, versus maybe there was just lost instructional time and they needed additional time to get, into the learning. And so that was a definition that had come from the department, and that was their terminology. But we had chose to use a phrase that we thought would better capture what was happening with COVID at that time.
Thank you. Thank you, Jordan, for that clarification. And Angela, you said, where are all the funds allocated, or is there a potential for future grants specifically for after-school programs? That's a Wendy question.
So there are a couple of answers to that. And actually, Dr. Mergel's segue into the data modernization, I think, is important to keep in mind. As ESSER closes out, the data that schools have as a result of having gone through COVID and implementing new programs and receiving these funds and using them in different ways is all very useful in creating additional grants. So we have encouraged districts, as they are, for example, creating a scope, and that's just a Word document that has parameters around the use of funds. And it says, this is the desire of the school, this is the problem, this is the solution, and these are the impacts to the students. As you do that document for ESSER funding, that same document can be used for other grants. The Washington Foundation being one, Steele Reeves being one, Murdoch being another. There are a number of local grants in Montana. We have some incredible foundations that do in fact ask similar questions, so that data that is being collected can be used going forward. On the after school and summer school programming, that again, going back to that 10% that Dr. Mergel was talking about, right at the bottom of that table on page 28, those funds are being expended now. So there are some entities who were not awarded funding in the 21st century grant cycle, and those are very similar in nature to ESSER guidelines. So if not almost identical. So we're using those entities who were not awarded during that because there simply wasn't enough funding. We're reaching out to them to see if they have programming efforts that could be done in this very short time frame. The summer school and the after school programming was available for the last 3 years. So it was posted on our website. We had application cycles that were done pretty much in a semester by semester basis. So if anybody has any specific questions on one, how to take an existing program, moving it forward, or are there additional funds for after and summer school programming, feel free to reach out to me separately or put your name in the chat and we can contact. We had a webinar last night. We'll have another one tomorrow at 10. So we'd be glad to assist with that.
Thank you, Wendy. And I just want to reach back to Trish about the timing of the systems. First thing that we did, I mean, I'm a teacher of 23 years. First thing we did was take our paper and pencil system that was very, very highly intensive with people, and we should. What was our Teach Montana, TMT? And that's been up and running for a year now, at least. And then we have other things that are coming online as well. Full well understanding that as our customers, our school districts, we don't want to flood them with way too many things and inundate them with all the innovation that we've done with these, but they will be coming online with it. And thank you, Julie, for putting in for Trish where the link is for all of that. We're about halfway through and we have some guests. I'm very pleased with our partnership with MSU. Dr. Urban and Dr. Stoddard, you're online now. So we're really pleased that we have given you great data and you're going to give us an analysis of the economics that occurred within our school systems with this influx of $600 million of COVID relief. So take it away.
Chris, you're muted. There you go.
So let me share here. All right. So we appreciate the opportunity to share what we found with all of you. You know, as a parent of kids in Montana schools, it was really interesting to dive more deeply into the data and see what's happened in this really, I know we're all saying this all the time, but unprecedented time for many of our students. So as you've already heard, the COVID relief funds infused significant amounts of resources into public schools in Montana. And we've analyzed the data up through May of what had been spent up at that point. And you can see that federal revenues led to a really big increase in the resources available per student. But they didn't replace state or local revenues. So it wasn't like this infusion of federal funds led either state government or local governments to cut back on what they were doing. It was an increase in these kind of temporary resources to deal with what was happening in this period. So this chart's just showing what those revenues per pupil look like in 2020 and then how much they were in 2022. And you can see that big jump on the federal revenues. So how was that money used? Looking at kind of an overall big picture of all of this, we can see that districts, when they reported these different kind of federal reporting categories, about half of the funds were used in this bucket that was called students' academic, social, emotional, and other needs. And about 25% of the funds were used for things like physical health and safety. But obviously, students' academic, social, emotional, and other needs, that's a pretty broad category. And so we dove more into exactly where was that money getting spent out. And what we saw was that by and large, most of the increase was in instruction. So resources for teachers and other kinds of instructional services really jumped between 2020 and 2022. We also saw an increase in support services, not quite as much as we saw for instruction, but all other kinds of things, whether we're talking about property or operations and management, all of those other kinds of areas really didn't see this big shift. So the COVID monies, by and large, increased instruction and support services. During this period, the big expense that we can see what happened was that districts rapidly added teachers, mental health professionals, nurses, and instructional aides, especially in the kind of heart of the pandemic there. So because of all of the health impacts of COVID, it wasn't surprising that districts were adding a lot of nurses. And we've also seen these kind of mental health impacts on students and a significant portion of the funds that were being used for mental health workers in schools. But schools were also increasing the number of teachers. And we'll see the impacts of that in a couple of slides here. Whoops, somehow I went backwards. Oh no. There we go. So because of this increase in teachers, one thing that we found is that student to full-time teacher ratios fell. So class sizes got smaller, and that was especially true in elementary schools. So if we look at primary school districts, the number of, sorry, folks, I'm not sure why I can't go back here. There we go. The number of students per teacher got a lot smaller going forward from, especially in that very first year after COVID. They've gone back up a little bit since then. If we're looking at K through 12 districts, there hasn't been as much of a change. And if we're looking at high school districts, again, there was kind of this increase in the number of teachers in that first year after COVID, and then it's kind of gone back in terms of the pupil teacher ratios. So what was the impact of that spending? Well, to answer impacts, we have to really drill down into the education context. And this is where those questions about how do we think about learning losses and what is all of that it really matters. So when we're defining this kind of learning loss term, the way we're thinking about it is that several things have happened. So there were obviously these big disruptions in the spring of 2020 when schools closed. And then after that, especially in some areas, there was an increased use of online schooling. But the other thing we've seen in this post-COVID period is a really sharp drop in student attendance and student engagement. And all of those factors together have led to a slower pace or even declines in proficiency in schools. And so Dr. Urban's going to talk through kind of what that has looked like.
Great. I'm glad you mentioned the learning loss term. I'm glad also that came up. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what you guys had referred to earlier about lack of instructional time. So one of the big things we saw using really good data on the entire K through 12 system and all students at all schools in Montana is that the pandemic really increased absences, and this is across grades. So students were less likely to come to school. These numbers have gone up substantially in grades 1 through 4, in middle schools, in high schools. And in particular, we saw that this is really an increase for the most vulnerable students. So if we compare this, the 2018 to 2019 academic year, so the pre-COVID world, if we can remember that, to the 2022 to 2023 academic year, we see that overall we do have this increase, particularly in high school absences. But if we look at schools that pre-pandemic had over 50% of students on free and reduced price lunch, that is a bigger number. More of those schools are seeing absences at a higher rate. For American Indian and Alaska Native students, we see absences have gone up dramatically. They've seen the highest increase, and to really, really high levels that we need to be, kind of watching going forward. And we also see this for special education students. So again, groups we really care about, things we really need to think about going forward. So in addition, again, here's that term, learning losses. We did see what we're going to call kind of like a decline in proficiency. So we want to see where students kind of should be based on their grade level. So what percent of them have proficiency in math or reading in grades 3 and 4, and then the same things in grades 7 and 8. And these are just the declines from that pre-pandemic period, and not even looking at that right away COVID period. We're looking at 2022 to 2023, so very recent data, and we're making that comparison. So overall, you'll see that there are drops in proficiency for 3rd and 4th grade math and reading, but that first line, the overall line, is much more pronounced in middle schools. So we see it a lot more for 7th and 8th grade students. And then again, we see it even more so for the most vulnerable students. Okay, so now let's get back to ESSER. So that's kind of the educational context, what's happening. We want to see kind of the style of ESSER spending and where people spent money, and how that kind of correlates with these learning losses. So we already told you that the most common use of funds was instructional support statewide. But one thing we saw is that when we looked again at that 2018 to 2019 data, the schools that were able to add teachers actually had higher proficiency to begin with. Okay, so those were the students who were outperforming the other school districts anyway, and this is among all schools that had some ESSER funding. So we're kind of getting rid of the smaller schools that Wendy talked about earlier that would have maybe gotten $2 or something like that. So we're not even looking at those. So these are just among all the ESSER recipients. You know, we're seeing that there was this disadvantage already. Okay, so then by 2023, we see that schools that were able to and not able to add teachers ended up having different trajectories entirely. So in the elementary schools in particular, for the schools that were able to add teachers with their ESSER money, they mostly returned to pre-pandemic levels by 2023, right? So having more instructors around, having you know, more instructional aides, more teachers, probably really helps students to combat some of these learning losses, to reach proficiency levels. And we did see these really strong elementary school rebounds. And if you remember Dr. Stoddard's earlier graph, those student-teacher ratios fell quite a bit for elementary schools. So not only were they adding teachers, they were adding quite a bit of teachers. And now in those schools, in those elementary schools that were unable to add teachers, they really lost a lot of ground. So this is really helpful, but you know, we have to keep tracking them and we should be worried about their proficiency going forward. Now in middle schools, it's a little bit of a different story. So in general, the adding teachers maybe helped a little bit for 7th or 8th grade reading, but we think that you know, we just overall are seeing a lot bigger of learning losses in middle schools in general. But also we saw less addition of teachers, even when they did add a teacher, maybe it's only one. So we think that it might just be like the volume effect of, you know, not having enough additions, but we're not seeing as much of an impact there. Okay, so what were the schools doing? What were districts doing when they were unable to add teachers? Well, we kind of walked through that eGrants data that you guys put a lot of information into, and we went through and we just read it because we're nerds like that. So one thing we found that was really common is that they had immediate health-related facility upgrade needs. So not minor things. They had to completely update their HVAC. They had mold removal that they had to do. There was asbestos mitigation. In some cases, there were huge building issues that really, really needed to be dealt with, almost like complete tear downs. A lot of replacing carpet with some easier to clean flooring that had not been cleaned in a really long time or in a good way. So just a lot of really important health concerns. Another thing we read is that there were some issues with hiring in tight labor markets. So one thing that we saw some schools use as a workaround is that they were having trouble finding people with commercial driver's licenses, and they couldn't find school bus drivers. So they actually bought another vehicle to better transport students so someone else could drive it. So the labor market was kind of pushing what districts could do. A lot of these problems were really isolated to a smaller set of districts, so we're not seeing in an aggregate sense that, you know, overall spending on these types of big renovations is showing up in the other data, but that could also just be that other schools spent less on renovations because it was kind of tricky during the pandemic. So again, want to highlight that those districts that added teachers tended to be those that were already starting with higher proficiency levels. And really, we just saw this highlighting of how these unmet health-related infrastructure needs really could be related to low performance in general. And there is a lot of research out there that does show that improving health-related infrastructure in schools does increase long-run student performance and actually downstream outcomes on things like earnings and things like that we can see much later, but we're not going to see it in data yet. it's too soon. So those students are definitely better off with these health upgrades, but we're not going to see it in the learning loss data. So we threw out some recommendations based on what we saw, and we think one of the most important things to kind of get those two groups of those schools that could and couldn't add teachers is to kind of just keep doing those regular health and safety related school facility assessments. Now that doesn't necessarily mean like, you know, fund a tennis court or something like that, but it means like, yeah, we should be checking for mold regularly. Make that really salient. Also, we think just monitoring student proficiency is really important, and particularly focusing on these schools and student groups that haven't recovered and do not have proficiency levels at the same level that they had prior to the pandemic, or maybe watching these schools a little bit more who had significant ESSER resources and now are going to lose those teachers. They know they were temporary, but they may have gotten accustomed to it. So really kind of tracking that. And then we think just continuing to monitor the attendance rates. And as you're saying, there are a lot of programs now, after school programs, learning loss programs. Innovate, think about different ways to support and increase student engagement. You know, we're economists, so we're always going to say evaluate it and then report back. And, you know, let's see if the ROI is there or if there's something else we can do better, more efficiently with the same dollars. Great. And feel free to reach out to us if you have questions or other things that we missed.
Let me
Dr.
stop.
Urban and Dr. Stoddard, do I have any questions? I know I've got two in the chat. Jordan, are there specific efforts that focus on our American Indian academic achievement gap that could address this disparity of growth? Anything that you recognized at all, Dr. Urban or Dr. Stoddard?
I know from other work that I've been doing with OPI that there are a number of programs kind of doing like an early warning system that Montana has to identify students who are at risk of dropping out. And a lot of that is focused on attendance and provides districts with that data to identify students that are at risk of dropping out. But in terms of other kind of, you know, more specific targeted efforts, you folks would probably know that better than we do.
There was nothing I saw in reading the e-grants data in particular, but yeah, I'd be interested. A lot of those are really short blurbs of what the best we can glean from what was spent.
Wendy, you might have had a relationship with a couple schools that may have used a unique program or advanced some of their dollars toward that.
So thank you, Superintendent. And Jordan, so that's a really good question. Some of our targeted groups throughout the state may not have been as actively involved in the proficiency-based education and all of those efforts that went out, project-based learning that went out last year and the year before. However, there has been some big discussion around what is called youth voice. And last year during the summer, I presented during a symposium for Native American students in Billings. And we talked about that in terms of the engagement of student in their own education, particularly as they move into high school, that part of the disconnect in the grade performance assessment occurs because of lack of engagement, whether that sees itself as non-attendance or just being physically present, but not actually engaged in the education. So we have talked a lot with the after and summer school programming efforts on that side. And we've had some schools do some really neat programming efforts in that. If you take a look at our website under stories, there's some really good ones. I don't know how many people know the Montana Children's Theater that goes around with a little red van. They're doing a real push for students learning in English and reading more. Again, theater, use of words, that kind of component. And so those have been something that we've been trying to target in the Native American community, both getting the youth involved, but also the schools at the same time in partnership with outside agencies.
Thank you. And I know Dr. Urban and Dr. Stoddard, you had a very high level view of what the data is. The stories that Wendy is talking about is because of the relationship she's had in distributing the dollars and looking at allowable uses and things like that. So there's lots of information that will continue to flow. There's also another question that came in, and it's for both of you. It's a rather lengthy one. but it is a math question. $605 million divided by 820 schools. We have 400 districts, but 820 schools, you're correct, equals approximately 730,000 per school, divided by population equals approximately $530 for every man, woman, and child in Montana. I realize the money wasn't equally granted, but as a taxpayer, did we get our money's worth? And also a big thank you for your research.
Yeah, thank you, Chip. That's a great question. So I guess, you know, we haven't done an ROI on these specific dollars, but I can certainly speak to this question about this investment in education. So Dr. Urban and I do lots of research related to education in general. And I think one thing that we saw doing this project was how much of a difference it really did make in schools that were able to add teachers, that their student outcomes were so much better. So one thing we know from the kind of larger body of research is that students who do better in school go on to earn a lot more as adults. So they become our future taxpayers and contribute to the economy. We also know that they're less likely to get into trouble. So we have lower crime rates, we have lower fewer numbers of health problems. And so it's not so much the return on our money today, but the return on our money in 20 years when those students are in the workforce. So, I mean, I would say, you know, that's the way to sort of think about it. But I don't know if I can give you a specific dollar return, unless you've got one, Carly.
No, I don't have a specific dollar return, but I would add a couple things. I think what's unique about this funding is that schools were, you know, allowed to flexibly decide, and there is a lot of kind of differences across districts in what they actually needed at the time. So it wasn't saying like you have to do X. And there was a lot of innovative stuff that we haven't even talked about in this like short presentation where, you know, in some cases, they just paid some teachers more to tutor students on the side, or they could kind of recognize the need and fill that need. And I think we kind of need more of those policies that are a little bit more flexible. I would add to what Chris said, that, you know, investing in kids is the greatest ROI in the long run that we have in terms of federal funding in particular. And not only does like adding, you know, spending more on education in terms of teachers and things like that really affect these long run earnings outcomes, but spending more on infrastructure and health related safety measures has been proven in other states, and Michigan in particular, to reduce long run crime rates, like dramatic crimes. So things that will improve our overall state livelihood from a lot of different perspectives. Yeah, I think we'll see eventually, but I would say probably as an economist, right? They always say you should never trust a one-handed economist. It's like on one hand this, on the other hand this. But investing in kids is one thing that economists tend to agree on has a strong ROI in the long run.
Well, thank you. There is another one that Tricia said, and I think it dovetails into what you had both said, is all this compliance-based spending or actual information about accountability? In other words, other than those two slides we just saw, is there specific evidence that the spending has helped? And I think you answered that just now. And if so, then how about specific examples on how it helped? I think you shared that the more flexibilities that there may have been, and I know you haven't necessarily, you know, done the entire frame of everything. And like I said, Wendy has got individual stories that can also be on our website, but there are things that are yet untold. And if so, then how about specific examples it helped? Is that information available to the public on your website? So all of this information that we have tonight will be on our website. It'll be on our ESSER page. Go to MTOPI, and on the right-hand side, you'll see a pull-down arrow that is ESSER. You go right there, and this information will be right there on the top of the page. So we have that. I see another one. If you are saying that flexibility in spending was helpful, wouldn't it make sense to provide more flexibility for district budgeting in the future?
So Superintendent, can I take a stab at that one?
Of course.
I think that is a really good question, given these ESSER funds, because I think when we started out with ESSER 1, it was very tight. We all felt in the schools like we had to spend it this way. This is what we needed to do. And as the grant progressed into 3, the amendability of it and the flexibility that students, that teachers, that superintendents went, oh, could we use it for this? That's where that creativity started to happen. And those that exercised that creativity and said, how about if we try this, actually have ended up with some pretty amazing results. And again, they are on our website. But I think, yes, going forward, having that flexibility is important. Having the accountability to review afterwards isn't just about saying, well, we made these results. Sometimes you don't make the results you think you could, but then you can say, that's not the way we want to go again. And so try something else. COVID funding was specific for that. There's language in the FAQs that frequently asked questions that specifically said, don't keep doing the same thing if it's not working. And as we went on in ESSER, the school districts have explored different options. And that's one of the best things about the ESSER team's job is we get to have those conversations with districts. We get to have these light bulbs that go on, and they're wonderful because we do have a very creative state. We have some very unique opportunities that we can offer our students in learning math, in reading, that places like California can't even touch. So very good question about the flexibility.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I know I've kept you. We have 4 minutes left to the remaining of the hour. We can definitely go longer. I'd like to introduce our CFO. This is April Grady. April, I know that Julie went into some details on data modernization and some other wonderful things that we have done with our set aside from these COVID dollars. If you could just put a little bit more sprinkles on this, and then we'll move to Katie. And so please, April.
I was going to try to share my screen and show everyone on the call how we're tracking those expenses. So give me just a second.
One of the things, just as she's doing that, the federal government, when we began the new Every Student Succeed Act, which replaced No Child Left Behind, is they demanded a state report card, also a district and a school report card. So when ESSER came into play, we also put the federal dollars annotated on there. So you see of a school, you would see how much the state, how much the federal, as much as how much of the local taxpayer is also associated with a per pupil expenditure. And it's interesting also to see the variance across our state. So one size does not fit all. Okay, April?
All right, do I have my screen up there? Can everybody see the document titled ESSER 3 Administrative Expenditures Overview?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. So we had in the administrative portions of the 10% of the ESSER dollars, we had 3 buckets. And like the superintendent said earlier that Julie did go into some of these. The first bucket is the leadership bucket, and a lot of that was instructional learning for teachers and superintendents in the realm of leadership. There were a lot of events that occurred with Modern Learners, the Learning Summits and the Summer Institute. And then we have a couple of new contracts that are in the works with KnowledgeWorks for personalized and competency-based learning. And then the Live, Love, Learn educational awareness for active learning and critical thinking. So those are going to be coming on board. For this pot of money, we have it all obligated except for $9,000 remaining. So we are working on getting those final funds obligated for this pot. Are there any questions on the leadership portion?
If I could just add, not to delay the time, but we're also innovating at the state level, not just with our legacy systems through data modernization, which she'll get to in a minute. But besides the teacher licensing system, we've also opened up the accreditation system. And that's what Dr. Mergel spoke about in how we recognize what a great school is. The other part, not just accreditation, but we're looking at our state standards. There are 11 teaching and learning standards. Math and reading are right in the window right now. And we have great Montana teachers and administrators and community members and families that are really looking at these standards. All of that is in leadership, as well as what we're going to discuss right now, a state loss of instructional time. So we used a lot of these dollars as a gift from the federal government to really innovate, to recognize the needs moving forward, not just what we currently need.
Right, thanks, Superintendent. So the loss of instructional time portion of the money, we have the Donors Choose contract, which I know is being allocated to schools currently, and it's been a really popular and successful program so far.
Harley, you're the only one. I see your eyes moving.
I only see you too.
I can see both of you.
Okay.
Something odd happened.
Yeah. Then I thought maybe we timed out, but no, not everybody.
Hi, you guys, this is Julie. I had to go out, I had to re-log in. I think there was something here at the agency because we're all actually located in the building.
I was wondering if it timed us out.
It clicked. So it clicked and then, I don't know. That's what I was thinking. Uh-oh, did we schedule a Zoom to just automatically close? But I don't think so.
Multiple hosts, just all right, I think we're back. Gotta love technology. Hopefully that we're all here again, and I believe April, hopefully you are on and ready. And she may jump in just a little bit. Just to make some. Perfect. And I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we will have our last presentation, which I think is really an important issue. Like I said at the beginning, we have a decennial study commission that is offered by statute. We have done a lot of homework around that, bringing 170 Montanans. We never turned away one of them. And it's extremely important that we have voices that we listen to. I think that's one thing in education we can always do better is to listen. But Katie, I know you're on right now. If you would just share just for the next few minutes of where we are with the budget working group that concluded its work, I believe, last month. And a white paper will be written and given to the legislature on what Montanans think about our funding formula and, of course, positive policies moving forward. So, Katie?
Sure. Well, let me see if I can just share my screen real quick, but I do have a PowerPoint, but I am having an issue sharing, so I will make sure I put it up, but it's just some graphs kind of looking. I think tonight what we really talked about is kind of the past, the present, and the future, and I think what I'm talking a little bit is about the future. So like the superintendent mentioned, we had a budget and education working group, and I know a number of the members are on here tonight. So to kind of summarize what we were looking at was talking about what the needs in the community are right now, what the challenges are that they see that they need to overcome, where they see the funding, where they would like the funding to go. And when we're looking at that, but also looking at ESSER, what we started to talk about is what are the lessons we can learn from ESSER, where the money was spent, where was the best like return on investment, where were the creative areas that were successful, and how we can use what we learned there and build it into what we're looking at for the future of funding for education here. But a lot of the things that were spent or some of the areas that were spent in ESSER also echo the needs that the community has been saying in their budget and education working groups. So the teacher retention and recruitment, we've seen that a lot of schools spent money in that area, and that's an area where they continue to see areas where they need possibly more support, more funding. It's just an area that it is that they've said it is in need, but also the building fund. We've seen a lot of the schools spent some of their money on the HVAC systems. That is something that was also raised during the budget and education working group of the kind of those long-term needs to make sure that the buildings are up to par. So a lot of where the school spent money in ESSER also echo where people are saying that we still have those needs. So as we look forward, as we present these community kind of feedback to the legislature, we just can, I think, again, continue to look back at what we learned in ESSER, how that money was spent, and how that we can continue kind of to compound and learn from what we did.
Thank you, Katie. Any questions for that? I know, Wendy, thank you for putting it into the chat. It is on our website, and a white paper will be given, of course, to the legislature on this. I also want to say that the donors choose. Thank you, Jordan, for also popping in. What a great opportunity. As a classroom teacher myself, school doors open. There's a lot of things that may not be in your classroom that you may need or wish or want for. So $500 is given. It's on our front page of our website. We opened that campaign about a week ago. We have at this point not even expended half of it. About 700,000 has been given. So we would like to make sure that other teachers have the opportunity to do this. Once the property it's shipped out, and the 500 includes the shipping and handling as well, doesn't come through our office. We used a nonprofit of Donors Choose. Donors Choose has been in Montana before. Some teachers across our state have used it in the past. So if you would like to pass it on to a classroom teacher, have them do this. We're keeping great data, and it becomes property of the school district afterwards. So there's also a website that's linked when you get onto our website. On that front page of our website, it's testimonials of what teachers are using them for, and it's all across our state. We have partnered with about 7 other states in the western part of our of America, of our nation, in this opportunity for our teachers. So all of the information, just as closure, will be on our ESSER webpage. Jump to the front of it. On the right-hand side, you'll see ESSER as a pull-down arrow, and it'll be right there with everything that we have. And I don't believe that, oh, I have April back. April, we're going to go ahead, and if you want to conclude with whatever document you had really quickly before we close
I'm not
out.
sure where I left off.
Okay. I think it was under learning loss that you had.
Okay.
And I can definitely have this document. It's just a one-pager, I do believe, that will be also available for everyone to see.
Okay. So loss of instructional time, I think I got through the first section with the Donors Choose and math innovation. Okay. So then I was talking about the tribal programs, and we do have money allocated to focus on tribal programs of about 824,000. This is where the career coaches were paid from, and then also the teacher residency program in the Waterford Early Learning Program contract. So out of this pot of money for the loss of instructional time, we have everything obligated. We do have a little bit of unobligated funds here of $976, so we'll make adjustments for that. So for database modernization, we had about $13 million. We have, like Dr. Mergel mentioned, used this money for the Teach Montana system, and then also the accreditation module. And then we are going to add some funding to the RANDA contracts for course code, staff manager licenses, and EPP licenses. We are working with a company called ClassLink to create an identity and access management system, which will be a single sign-on system for all teachers and school staff to be able to access any of the systems that OPI hosts all in one place with one single sign-on. We're working with ServiceNow for some professional service hours so we can implement a procurement workflow so we can help with some of our contracting flow and how we get those through the procurement process. And then we are also working with a company or a system called IntelliGrants that will be able to provide us with an allocation tool for school funding allocations. This is going to be in tandem with eGrants for about the next 18 months while we get this system into place. So we will probably in the future be able to provide some more functionality and ease of use for schools when they go in for their school funding allocations. And then we are adding some years and functionality to our Qualtrics contracts, which is our needs assessment survey. So this sheet right here shows that we have about $1 million left in unobligated or committed funds for data modernization, but I have been working diligently with our IT staff on finding more innovative solutions that we can use this data modernization money for. And one of those is we are going to add some years of service to the accreditation module. So this afternoon, our final unobligated total is down to about $571,000, and we'll continue to work on being able to come up with ways to utilize that funding.
Thank you.
Yes.
Any questions for April on what the Office of Public Instruction is using for its entire funds? And I appreciate them in red because that means that those are monies that might be left over. Our goal here is to use this gift in its entirety and to make sure that our give back to the state is not just for needs filled, but for the future use as well. I want to thank you all for partaking your evening. This is opening football night. And I very much appreciate that you're spending time as interest with this. All these documents will be available for you as well on our website. Just go to the first page, ESSER, on the right-hand side, pull down that arrow, and it'll be right at the very top. Blessings to you as we all move forward and we all recognize that we are putting our Montana students first. So blessings to all of you. Thank you for joining us.